everyone, this is Morgan here at PCC and welcome to PCC eRx Beyond the Basics. This session is intended to provide you with an in-depth understanding of all the different advanced configuration options that are out there for PCC eRx. We'll review some troubleshooting techniques that you can use while you're creating prescriptions, as well as cover a number of commonly asked questions that we get about prescribing with the tool. Most of what we'll review has to do with the current state of PCC eRx, and we'll talk a little bit about some enhancements you can look forward to. But before we get to all of that, I think it's important to talk about the history of PCC eRx and how we arrived at the tool that you're prescribing with today. In 2017, we weren't satisfied with the eRx vendor that we were using for sending prescriptions out electronically, and we created a new partnership with a company called FDB, First Data Bank, and their tool called MedsTracker. And at the time, MedsTracker was a very hospital-based platform, and so you might have already picked up on that when you're creating prescriptions or working with charting and the rest of PCC eRx, where some of the medications or the ways that you would dose them seem more like something you would utilize if you were doing rounds at the hospital, or if your specialty was something outside of pediatrics. So the partnership was really great. However, when we were looking for enhancement requests, those wishes would go over to FDB, and they would need to make sense for both our clients and for the hospitals that were out there. In 2019, FDB approached us with a unique opportunity to actually purchase the code behind the scenes for PCC eRx. And so we were very excited about that opportunity, and we brought the code in-house here to PCC. So the main benefit there is that now we have full control over the code. We can continue to make pediatric specific improvements. And also these changes do not need to apply to hospitals because we're the only ones who are utilizing that code. So that all being said, now that we own the code, there are still a couple outside entities that we have vendor connections with. And I'll mention these just because these may come up throughout the session or conversations you have with the support team at other times. We partner with Exostar, which is the company that provides the electronic prescribing of controlled substances, your EPCS account that you use the hard token with, and the application on your phone. We also have a connection through SureScripts, which is the hub that takes prescription data back and forth between EHR vendors and pharmacies. And we also do still communicate with FDB to an extent. They have a very extensive drug database, and that's what we utilize inside PCC eRx. That database is widely used at other vendors, including Epic and things like that, if you do still, like I said, rounds at the hospital. So those are the vendors that we still partner with, but going forward, we have the incredible opportunity to continue to make changes to PCC eRx. So after you watch this video, and as you're working through and writing prescriptions every day, if you have feedback for us about things that you'd like to see done differently, please reach out to us. That's how we determine what we work on next. So that all being said, let's take a look at some frequently asked questions that we get here at PCC. And I'm imagining that at least one of these will resonate with you of a question that you've had before yourself. Why can't I find this medication? Or DMEs, things like spacers, tubing, nebulizers. Antibiotics, why sometimes is a day supply default to 30 days when I was expecting something more like 7 or 10? The only option for this prescription is to print. Why is that? I just want to delete this prescription. Help me understand how I can do that on my own. Favorites, we get lots of questions on favorites, so we'll cover a small section on how favorites truly work. We'll cover weight-based dosing because I know there can be some questions once you get inside the tool. How do you do the weight-based dosing that you're expecting? And this last one here, this one's pretty new. I'm not able to respond to this change request, so what do I do? We'll cover lots of other topics that aren't on this list, but hopefully something here already feels like you're going to learn something from this session. All right, first up, why can't I find this medication, spacers, and tubing and nebulizers? So if we think back to what I just mentioned about FDB and the drug data being outsourced to that company, there are thousands of medications, and there's hundreds of thousands of these dosing statements, which are those little lines of sample sets of directions you can pick from. So those come from FDB, and we provide them to you here on the screen. So there's lots to talk about here. after all is said and done, you have control over what you do and do not display. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you think about just a basic medication, when you pull up the patient's chart and you jump down to this prescribed section, if you were to search for, let's say, Tylenol, the results that are displayed on that screen are filtered out by what is believed to be appropriate for that patient's age. So Tylenol comes in a lot of different forms, right? And if you think about a really small infant, you're going to want to see things like liquids and suppositories and not necessarily tablets, but you also know the IVs are in there, and that is sort of the hospital side of things. So the first set of results is always defaulted to this option up here, the one right next to the highlighted orange circle for Quick RX. That's the option that'll be set there as a default every time you search. Those results will be filtered out by the patient's age. So if we don't even think about the DMEs and things like that, if you're having trouble finding something, the first thing I would say is click on full product search, because that will expose all of the search results that exist in the database, irregardless of the patient's age. And so that's a great way to look and see what's out there in the database that isn't necessarily filtered out for my patient. Now, when it comes to DMEs and spacers, all that kind of stuff, you're always going to want to click on full product search. You won't find them under Quick RX. So if you, like I said in this example here, if you put in aero chamber, you'll want to jump right to full product search, and that will show you all the different matches for aero chambers. If you're having trouble finding things, the first thing I would suggest, besides switching to full product search, is look at your search criteria and what you're putting in there. I almost suggest that less is more. If you think about oral contraceptives, so like orthotricycline low, is there supposed to be a space between them? Is there supposed to be a dash? And so if you find your search results aren't getting what you want, kind of back up what you put into the search and try a little bit less and see if that gets you what you're looking for. The next thing I might bring up is thinking about whether or not what you're searching for is commercially available. And when I'm speaking to that, I'm talking more about the concept of a compound. So something that the pharmacy has to mix for you on site based on your order and things like that. So a great example here would be Magic Mouthwash. We've entered some custom compounds for you in the system, but like a diaper paste or a diaper cream, everyone has like kind of a different version that they like to use. That's something that you'd want to enter into the system, and things that are not FDA approved yet will not be on this list. So you might be asking yourself now, what do I do if I can't find what I'm looking for? There's two different ways that you can still create a prescription for something that isn't listed in the database. The first one is right here on the screen down in the bottom left-hand corner. So in this example, I searched for aero chamber. I see some results here, but maybe it doesn't exactly match what I want. You can click on add custom medication there, but I would almost not recommend that you do that. It will give you the false impression that you'll be able to send it out electronically. So this will get you out of the jam. You can create a prescription for it, but you will get stuck in kind of print only mode, where your only option to finish processing that prescription is to print it. It won't qualify for electronic transmission. SureScripts that we just talked about requires that all medications have a code in the background in order to send that from PCC EHR over to the pharmacy. And these custom medications that you can add on the fly here do not qualify because they don't have that code in the background. So there's a different way to do this. We'll cover it a little bit later that makes it sort of an official entry that will have that code and therefore qualify for electronic transmission. So I think that's all I want to cover for finding medications, but just remember, check full product search and check your search criteria because you might actually have too many things in that search field in order to find what you're after. Next up, antibiotics. Why does it default sometimes enter in for 90 days or for 30 days when I'm expecting something more like 10? With all the different statements and the drugs that are available in this system, it's important to know conceptually that if there is no duration listed in that statement, it will populate for a 30-day supply, which makes sense for a lot of other medications, maintenance meds and things that the kids are on most of the time, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for antibiotics. So I would recommend when you're searching for these antibiotics to be on the lookout for statements that are duration based. And I've highlighted these in orange here at the bottom. So you'll see some options up at the top. Those are great as far as that's what the patient wants to take per dose, but you'll see there is no duration listed at the end. So two things to kind of note here. If I was to focus on the ones at the bottom that have a duration at the end, if I was to click that statement, that one's weight based, it's going to do some calculations here, but ultimately the day supply will import onto that prescribing screen for 5 days, 7 or 10, depending on which one I pick. And if you were instead to pick one up at the top, that will populate that day supply field to be 30. So you'll want to avoid using those unless that's something that pertains to your patient. As I mentioned on the last slide, we will talk about how you can hide some of these statements if they don't make sense. If you find yourself always clicking one of these and getting frustrated that it's a 30-day supply, just know that the 30 days is meant to apply to all medications. And if you do have antibiotics that feel cumbersome having them in there, you have the capability to hide those so they don't show up in the search criteria after you search for, say, Septinir here. Additionally, I'll show you a little bit later how you can create brand new statements. And so if you think about something like a albuterol, where there's lots of different options that are in there, maybe you have a very specific preference of 2 to 3 puffs every 4 to 6 hours, and you don't see a statement that exactly matches that. You can create it so that it comes up automatically for you and for the entire office, because it would be widespread across all users. The last thing I'll say about these statements is don't focus too much on trying to find the perfect statement. If you pull up the drug, you look at them quick, there really isn't anything that matches, just click on any of them, because what that will do is bring open the edit prescriptions window and you can manually change any information that you want to on that field. This is intended to make things a little bit faster, but if you don't find that it's fast by being able to find the statement that applies to your patient and their situation, just click any one of these statements and get that window open and make the changes locally on that page. All right, let's talk a little bit about weight-based dosing. And I know weight-based dosing is something you're very used to doing. You probably have the calculator right there or your phone, and you know what dose you want the patient to have. And sometimes what'll happen is there's a little bit of a confusion between the statements that are provided in here and what happens on that next page when it pulls up. And so I'll walk through this for you, and hopefully at the end of this, it'll make a little bit more sense about how to use it inside the system with the full understanding. I know you know how to do this outside of the tool. So we were just looking at that page with all the different statements there, and the important difference between those statements and what you see here on the screen is the statements are milligrams per kilogram per day in divided doses. And so if you think about this amoxicillin one here, this originated from the amoxicillin suspension, 90 milligrams per kilogram in 2 equally divided doses. So when you click on that statement, this window will pop open. A lot of things happen on here, but the most important part is that it translates it from milligrams per kilogram per day to milligrams per kilogram per dose. And so you'll see what I've highlighted here in orange. This is to bring attention to the fact that this went from 90 milligrams per kilogram per day to 45 mg per kg per dose. The first thing I'll see people do when this window pops open is they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. I wanted 90, and they'll change that to 90 and hit calculate again. And then they've essentially doubled that dose. And then they're concerned that they're overdosing the patient. So just know that the statements per day, and then it converts it into the per dose value here, which does make sense. You are ultimately looking for the volume of the dose for each time the patient needs to take that, and not the total volume the patient would need for the whole day, and then tell them to divide it by 2. So that being said, once you've picked that statement, like I said here, it inputs 45 in that field. It takes the patient's weight in kilos. That comes over from the EHR, and it does the calculation for you. You can make adjustments to that weight on the fly if that makes sense for your patient. Let's say you're working from a phone note or something like that, and you haven't seen them in the office in a while. What this does is it applies the same math that you're doing on your calculator here on the screen. In the case of amoxicillin, this defaults to the 400 per 5 suspension. There are other options that are available in that dropdown, of course, but it takes the 45 milligrams per kilogram per dose in the 20 kilo patient, does the math. And what happens here is it will calculate the value needed in that box. And you'll see up here, this is 10 mLs. And if you did the math on your phone, you'd say, well, it should be more like 11.25. And you'll note that over here in the red text, what the true calculated value is. And it lets you know that it adjusted it down to 10 mLs. And so this can be something to get used to a little bit in here. This also pulls from FDB and their drug data. And there's a concept, as far as they're concerned, about measurable increments. And something like amoxicillin doesn't come with a tool like this, but if you think about some of the kits that you can get, it already comes with a syringe, and maybe there isn't a marking for every 1 ml or every half ml. It's just, it's 2.5 or 5, things like that. And so they're attempting to give you what they believe to be a measurable dose. It'll be easy for your patients and your parents to measure. In this case, it took the 11.25 and says, well, we can do it in 2.5 ml increments. It takes the equivalent dose range. And so we're not going to go, outside of that range and adjust it to a measurable dose. You as a clinician have all the capability to go over to that field and type in 11.25 if you do want to be that specific. You could do 11 or 12, whatever you want to enter there will ultimately be what's sent out to the pharmacy. But that's why sometimes the rounding does seem a little bit more aggressive than kind of just a little bit up from 11 or down. A couple of things to note here, as I mentioned, the default specifically for amoxicillin anyway is 400 per 5. You could click on that dose form and you'll see the other options for 250 and 200. And if you were to say change that to the 200 per 5, it would double the dose to 20 mLs per dose. Over here underneath where the weight-based dosing part, where it says 45 mg per kg, there is a calculated value section in light gray. That's the part I usually point people to kind of keep track of what the ultimate dose is, so that you'll know, first of all, that you haven't gone back to the milligrams per kilogram per day value, for example. In this case, because we started with 45 mg per dose, you'll see in the calculated value section, we rounded down to 10. And if you look at that section there, instead of it being really 90 mg per kg per day, it's more like 80 based on the fact that you rounded it down to 10. Anytime you make changes to the other fields, that calculated value section in gray will keep up with you so you can make sure that you are still ultimately getting the right dose for your patient. One other thing I'll mention on this page, there are an adjustment section here on this amoxicillin. So things like liver and renal impairment, if you wanted to click on those, it would give you some ways to adjust those doses in case that pertains to your patient. But those are the big takeaways for weight-based dosing. The statements are per day, and when you get onto this screen, it does convert it into the per dose value. All right, next up, can I send a 3-month supply of ADHD medications? Yes, with the exception of probably mail order pharmacies. Most states and most pharmacies will not let you send a prescription for 90 tablets. If the patient's taking it once a day, you are able to send the equivalent of 90 days worth of medication in one prescription. So with PCC eRx, you can do something right here with this button called Create 3-month Supply. And what this would do is creates the equivalent of 3 single 30-day prescriptions. They'll all be sent over to the pharmacy. The first one will start, and I'll show you the dates in a moment, but the first one would potentially start today, and then 30 and 60 days from there. And the theory being that the pharmacy would fill the first one today or in the next couple of days when it's appropriate, and put the other 2 prescriptions on hold in the patient's profile. So you can still send single 30-day supplies. You don't have to click this button, but if you are interested in sending the equivalent of 90 days over in one prescription, go ahead and click that checkbox. What this will do will expose 3 different dates to fill. It will default to today's date as the starting date, and then 30 and 60 days out from now. You can make adjustments to any one of these dates right here on the screen. So let's say you want the first one to start in a couple days. Go ahead and change that value, and the next 2 will recalculate 30 and 60 days into the future. You can also, what I would refer to as short date them. And so if you want the first one to come out today, but the next one, you want them to be able to fill it at the earliest 28 days in the future, you can certainly change the date right here on the screen as well. As you start to make changes to those dates, it'll show you in light gray what I've highlighted here on the left-hand side of how much you've predated those two prescriptions. If you find that it's pretty common, you always do 2 days ahead or 5 days ahead, you can go into My Settings and pre-calculate that. So you'll see what I've highlighted here in orange under 3 month supply. You could set a date that you'd want to have those. Every time you click that button, it always short dates the second and the third prescription to be 2 days earlier, 5 days earlier, something like that. When you send these off to the pharmacy, like I said, they should be filling one now, put the other two on hold for the patient's profile. Throughout the rest of the chart, you'll see that you sent 3 month supply. That way, when the patient calls back next month and is asking for a refill, something like that, you can look in the patient's chart and say, oh, you should just still have 2 more on file at CVS, things like that. All right, commonly asked question, the only option for this prescription is to print. Why is that? We talked about one earlier, and that was when you use that custom medication on the fly option. Because SureScripts requires that code in the background, you would not be able to out electronically, and that might be fine. The patient could still be in the office and you intended to print it out anyway, something like a speech therapy prescription. But most of the time, users are attempting to get those prescriptions to go out electronically. The first thing I'll highlight that'll get you stuck in print only mode is the lack of an address underneath your name. And you've probably never really noticed that. I wouldn't pay attention to it either. It has to do with SureScripts again. And SureScripts uh, requires that every prescriber tell us what address in which they're creating those prescriptions for. And so all prescribers have an NPI, but also SureScripts requires that you have something called an SPI, and that's a SureScripts provider identifier. They issue you one for every location in which you work. So if you work at a one location practice, you're never going to run into this specific version of this. But those of you that might work at multiple locations, or sometimes you only work at one of those locations on the weekend for a clinic and something like that, you could run into this. It's very easy to fix in the system. Your office manager can certainly help you with this. If you do need help, just call PCC. It's easy for us to fix. But just be on the lookout there underneath your name. If you don't see your address, that'll be one of the reasons why you can't send it out electronically. We talked about this first one here, the free text medications. There's a better way to enter custom medications. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Those ones should allow you to send them out electronically. You'll want to avoid time-based units such as days, weeks, and months. These are options available to you in the dropdown where you'd see mLs, tablets, and things like that. SureScripts, again, does not allow these time-based units of measure. You want to tell the pharmacy staff a quantifiable amount of how much medication you want. And so you might say, oh, I just want an appointment for this week. Well, that's understandable, but SureScripts wants you to kind of say, a 30-gram tube, something like that. We do leave those in the system available to you because sometimes they would apply, again, to speech therapy prescriptions, things like that. All right, let's delete some prescriptions. So perhaps you created a prescription and you changed your mind later, or you're working with, nursing staff that created that, and later on you decided you don't want to send that prescription. You also might have already sent the prescription to the pharmacy and you've realized that there was an issue with it, or you changed their mind. The family said they wanted it to go to Walgreens and you sent it to CVS. There's a lot of reasons you might want to delete something. So there's two different experiences you'll run into. The first one at the top is a prescription that has not yet been sent to the pharmacy. And you'll see two key things here. You'll see that red pencil, and you'll also see the word unsigned. Unsigned is a signal that this prescription has not been sent to the pharmacy. In this case, very easy to delete. You can just hit that trash can there. The pencil is also available because you haven't yet sent it to the pharmacy. Maybe you want to make a little bit of a change to that prescription and still send it. You can do that by clicking on the pencil. Once you've already sent the prescription to the pharmacy, you'll see what I'm showing here at the bottom. And it said there's no pencil. You can't edit a prescription that you've already sent. You'd want to delete and start over. But also in the red text here, you'll see eRx with what we call a date and time stamp. So you'll be able to see when that prescription was truly sent out. As I mentioned, if there was an error or somebody changed their mind, all you would do here is hit that trash can with the system here, we have a way to electronically cancel the prescription with most pharmacies. So you'll get a little pop-up that says, this has been electronically canceled. You may still see times where the pharmacies in your area don't participate with electronic canceling. So you'll get a phone number there and you'd want to call them, especially if there was a serious issue with that prescription. You can also delete pending prescriptions being the ones that have not yet been sent right from the eRx task queue. So maybe you're not in the patient's chart, but you're working from the queue. There's a lot of different patients there. These may be ones that you prepared and didn't send and change your mind. Again, maybe the nursing staff prepared them for you and you ultimately don't want to send them. Same trash can will be here. Just go ahead and hit that, and that will delete that prescription from ever being sent to the pharmacy. Similar idea is being able to discontinue historic medications and med history. So medication history being that part in the chart that's the combination of prescriptions that you've sent in the past that are still active, so those maintenance meds the patients are usually on, things you may have imported from retail Rx history. So you may not have written it yourself, but someone at the emergency department in your area did, and you imported it. Also manually entered medications, such over-the-counter things, stuff like that. When you're in medication history, you can do a couple different things. You can, if you've decided that these treatments are no longer appropriate, or again, you've changed your mind on this, you can hit that trash can and delete them individually, as well as choose the cleanup med history button. This down sort of in the middle left-hand side. Well, when you click on that, you'll see a bunch of different checkboxes exposed next to those entries. You'll have a select all button at the top, and you can select as many as you want to discontinue those all in bulk. The one thing I would caution here with this trash can is if you're deleting medications from medication history, you're marking them inactive as of today. So the discontinuation date, the DC date, that is going to be today. If something did happen with the patient, there was an adverse reaction and you wanted to document that you stopped having them take it a week ago, or there was an allergic reaction and something like that, and you want to document the date, you will want to click on that red pencil, pull it up, and you can document what date you discontinued that. So while you're deleting medications, the default prompt that you'll receive is what's on the left here. So you're deleting medications, and this window will pop up and ask you for the reason why you're deleting that. Some people do really like to document those reasons, and that's great. You can leave the setting as is. If you'd prefer to just get this sort of yes/no prompt that's over on the right-hand side, just let PCC support know, and we can set that up for you. That is an office-wide change. That's not a per provider permission, but usually everybody's kind of in agreement on what window you'd like to see. Okay, favorites. So there's a lot of questions about favorites, and we continue to make improvements to try to make them more, sort of self-explanatory, a little bit easier to use. So I'll cover sort of the basics of favorites. And if you still have questions, we definitely would love to hear from you. So there's 3 options for prescribing from favorites, and there's a couple different ways to create them. And so we'll cover all those different avenues. First up here, we'll talk about, let's see. We'll talk about creating a favorite, or using a favorite, using a favorite down here when you're searching for a medication. So I've already created a favorite for EpiPen, and I haven't used any of the top ones yet. I'm just searching down for my medications for my patient. And when I search for EpiPen, I'll see some results that come up, both what's in the database, that's what the entries that are there at the bottom, and then right above that is a little bit longer version, and that's my favorite. So I can easily pick that favorite if I want to, but that's the way I'll find a favorite if I know what I'm after. In the middle section here, that's called the tiled section, and that is something that you can configure to show however many you want. I think our default is 21. I've got mine only set up to show 9 favorites, but I could have like 100 favorites, right? And so how would I know what favorites are going to show in that section? And it's intended to be on what's frequently used by you specifically as a provider. But we find that there's a little bit, it's kind of buggy a little bit with that. And so I think the easiest way to find your predictable favorites all in one place is to click on the favorites drop down. And that's the option here at the top. In that dropdown, it will list all of your favorites in alphabetical order. There's a little search bar, so you can kind of, if you want to jump down to something that's at the bottom of the alphabet, you can certainly do that. So you've got the three options. I can search for it if I know what I'm after. I can jump right to EpiPen, see all the different options that I have. I might be drawn to this tiled section in the middle, and that's great. I can pick, you can prescribe right from those, just click on that blue text, or ultimately I can go to the favorites drop down and see all of my favorites all at once. The top two, the drop down and that tiled section, are customizable on whether that you view them or not in my settings for each provider. Now, we'll talk about how do I add a favorite, and there's two ways. One is pretty easy, and that's what I'm showing here on the screen. When you're creating a prescription for a patient, they're probably going to be in the room, but let's say I use this medication all the time and I like to do it for 30-day supply with no refills. If I know that I'm going to use this again in the future, I can either click on the heart that's right next to the drug name or the text-based button down at the bottom, and that will add that right to my favorites. That's immediately going to display in that drop down as well as the tiled section and when I search for that drug. As you are starting to prescribe from your favorites list that you already built, when that pulls this up, let's say you pick something from the list, this window opens up. If it's already listed on your favorites, that heart will be blue. That text-based button will be called grayed out, so you won't be able to click on that to add it to your favorites again. But you could also create a couple of favorites right here. If you know you prescribe Sotera a lot, you could do the 18s and the other strengths and add those to your favorites right from this window. If you know you want to create a bunch of favorites and it spans across a number of different drugs and really has nothing to do with the patient being in the room, you could jump into My Settings and you'd see this window here. From there, you would just click on Add New Favorite. You'll see the search criteria that comes up. You can type in the drugs that you're after, and create those favorites that way if you wanted to work on a bunch at once. Other things I'll highlight here. Everyone should be set up to the manual favorites generation, which is what I was just showing you. Either you're creating them on the fly by hitting that heart, you're coming into this page and hitting Add New Favorite, and that way you have full control over what favorites are listed there. Some users opt to try the automatic setting, and I think it's pretty cool, but it does have some limitations. The automatic favorites instead will pay attention to everything that you're prescribing throughout the day, and will create favorites for you based on the prescriptions that you've written. So it's over a 6-month rolling average, and it will create those favorites, and they kind of flow in and out of popularity depending on how frequently you're prescribing them. There's a limit of 20 things that it will remember, and so you might write only 15 or 20 different drugs, so that could be useful for you. In addition to the automatic favorites setting, you can at any point still use that heart to add something to the favorites list. You can come right in here and add it that way. So you're welcome to try either one. If you turn automatic on, let it generate some favorites for you, and you find it's remembering too much or something that you wouldn't normally prescribe a lot, you can certainly jump back to manual settings. Right here are the two toggles for show favorites as a drop-down menu or show them as a tile. And if you do want to utilize that tiled section, this is the place where you configure the number in which would display there. Last up is the configuration panel, and that's how you decide what stays on your profile for favorites. The top section is the pinned ones. Those are the ones that you've manually entered either by hitting that heart or choosing this Add New Favorite section here. If you had tried out automatic, you'd have a separate section for automatic favorites. And then there will be one at the bottom called excluded favorites. And so there's a couple things you can do if you've generated favorites that you don't really want to use. You might just leave them, or you could come in here and sort of make some changes. And you either can click on the red pencil and delete it. That will completely remove it from your list. Or you can also click on the little thumbs down there. And what that will do, that will sort of vote it down to the excluded section. So it's not gone for good, but maybe you just don't want it on your screen all the time. So there's a lot that you can configure here in the favorites tool. Again, if you have questions about this, definitely give us a call. The last thing I'll mention here is if you want to share your favorites with others, if you have administration rights, there's an option for copy favorites. And so if you're one of the managing providers and you've got this list and it feels really helpful to you, you could offer it to your colleagues to copy it to their profile. And you either can supplement the list of what they've already created, or you can wipe out their list, especially if they've got some that just feel like they want to start over and take a look at your list. You can certainly do that. All right, here's another question that I get called, where's my swish? And when I'm referring to the swish, I'm talking about the blue icon that's on the far left-hand side of this image. That swish is available both in prescription history and medication history, and that's intended to create a new prescription for today's date of exactly what I wrote last time. So I want the same drug, the same strength, the same frequency, same quantity, things like that. People like the swish so much that when it's not there, they wonder where it is and they want to be able to use it. So a couple things will happen with the swish. Usually why it's missing, because if you think about a visit from 6 months ago and you wrote for this Proventil and the patient's back in the office, but you might have been looking at the chart before they came in to see what happened with the last visit. And if you were to enter into PCC ERX in the context of the visit from 6 months ago, you're not going to see the swish if you're trying to prescribe from within the visit in which you originally wrote it, which makes sense the day of, right? If you just wrote it today, you're not going to need to renew it today, but sometimes that's what happens is you're in the old chart. So just make sure that you're in the current encounter for today, whether that's the visit, the phone note, portal message, or things like that. You also won't see the swish if it's something that hasn't yet been sent out to the pharmacy. So you might want to look over where RX details is on the far right-hand side. If it says the prescription's pending, that means it hasn't yet been sent out, and therefore you would not be able to renew it again until it's been sent. All right, now I'm going to get into a section of optional configuration for PCC ERX. So please don't feel obligated that you have to go back to your desks after this and make these changes. These are all those cool things that I think people should be aware of in case you want to take advantage of these options. First up is adding custom search terms. And the example I always use for this is if you're having trouble finding a medication, like maybe there's a word that you use to identify what medication you're after, and you always type it in and you can't find it. And eventually you go back and you figure out where it is. What you can do is create a custom search term of a mapping to that word that you like to use to help you find the drug faster so that you don't get frustrated. If you think about sodium chloride nebulizers, who knows what they're going to be under, right? It could be like saline, it could be, NS, all sorts of things. And so if you're trying to find something and it's hard to find, take the time to add one of these custom search terms. It makes this a lot easier for you when you're searching. You can also do this with brands and generics. There is no direct brand to generic mapping inside PCC ERX. Oftentimes you'll be prompted for the generic if the brand is sort of off the market and things like that. But if you always want to type in the brand name because it's easier to spell and remember, you can set up these custom search terms to map you directly to the generic and make it a lot easier to find. Another idea that you can use in this same idea is creating little groups of medications. And so instead of doing the search term of saline nebulizer for your sodium chloride, you could say, I want to enter the search term allergy, where I would normally put in, loratadine. I want to type in allergy and see a group of things that I've associated with that search term. So in this case, I've set up a search term of allergy. I've just connected some drugs that I like to write. This is an office-wide search term. So, but you don't have to tell anybody about it, right? So you can create your own with your name, and that's your list of drugs that you like to prescribe. Or you could tell the other users at the office that it's there in case it's helpful to them. So you could create this for ADHD medications, allergy medications, anything you want. You can create these little custom categories so that when you're searching something like this, where I might type in loratadine, where that field is, I could instead type in allergy and see anything that I've mapped to that term. All right, next up is sort of similar. It's called adding custom medication warnings. This is probably my favorite out of all these configuration options. So what you can do here is set up medication warnings that will map next to the drug name when you search for it. And so these could be both positive and negative warnings. You'll see a couple different options here. Maybe for certain drugs, you have a coupon at the front desk and you want to make sure the patient can take advantage of those savings. Maybe every time you write this mebendazole prescription, it goes off to the pharmacy and then they call you and let you know that it's super expensive and do you want to try to prescribe something else. You could think about putting these medication warnings for something you always know needs a prior authorization and you want to avoid that, or Medicaid won't cover this one, or this one is the one Medicaid will cover. So you can set these up in this pathway I've listed here. If you have administration rights, you can get into the system and add those medication warnings. And so you'll see I've added these for a couple of these drugs so that when I search for them, I'll see that note there and I might decide to prescribe something else at that point. Right. We'll take a look at some safety checking levels inside PCC eRx. And if what I'm about to show you looks totally new, that means your safety checking alerts are still set to the highest level, which is how you were pre-configured before you started with PCC eRx. We leave all of these safety checking levels on to the highest setting so that when you're getting used to the system, you don't potentially make an error that we could have warned you about. And so I'll tell you about all the different things that you can change as far as lowering some of these safety checking levels, which this might be helpful for you at your practice. So there's a lot going on here in this page, but there's a number of different safety checking things that'll happen while you're prescribing. There's something called a proactive alert, and then there's a reactive alert. And so the proactive ones, if you think about the kind of the easiest thing to think about is like a drug allergy. If you've got an allergy for amoxicillin on your patient's chart and you try to prescribe them penicillin, depending on what your settings are, you're going to see a little proactive alert, and those are the colorful bubbles you'll sort of see off to the left-hand side in the search results. Those you can kind of push past. You can click on them if you want. It'll tell you a little bit more about that interaction, but they ultimately don't stop you from prescribing. And then you'll start entering the information on the prescription and you go to send it off to the pharmacy. If there is a true interaction, you'll see another window that pops up. That's what's called a reactive alert. And those ones, you do have to provide a reason why you're choosing to move forward. And you as the clinician have weighed those benefits and the risks, and you can document why you select to prescribe that. So that's what I'm talking about controlling here, is those different alerts. So first up is drug food. Drug food interactions are only the proactive alert. So only the little colorful bubbles. You're not going to get stopped later if the medication, let's say, shouldn't be taken, with broccoli and things like that. So with the drug food, you have a 1, 2, and a 3. We have it set to 3 being that's the most amount of alerts that you'll get. 1 is contraindication, 2 is severe, and 3 is moderate. And so by saying 3, you're saying I want to be alerted for all 3 of those categories there. If you choose to make a change to that, just be sure to click update value so that change is saved to your account. And I should mention that these are safety checking alerts that apply to the entire office. Next up is the drug allergy alerts, and these are separated into 3 different options. The first one is like a direct allergy. So my patient has an amoxicillin allergy and I try to prescribe amoxicillin. That would be that first option there. Next up is the group. So amoxicillin versus a penicillin prescription. And the third, this is the one I see the most that gets adjusted, is the cross sensitivity. So amoxicillin versus something from the cephalosporin group. And so if you aren't interested in being prompted for those cross sensitivities, you can uncheck that box. Next up is drug disease checking. And so this is the drug you're trying to prescribe against something from the patient's problem list or something that you've diagnosed today during that visit. And so that's a 1, 2, and 3, and you can make adjustments to those if you'd like. The next one is drug-drug interaction checking. And so that's the drug you're trying to prescribe right now against something else the patient is currently on. And we know that sometimes 2 drugs can cancel each other, or together, they're stronger than you want them to be. So that's a good one that you'll have there. That's, again, a 1, 2, and a 3 for the severity there. This next one has to do with duplicate drug class checking. And this is the one I think I get the most questions on. This is on or off. And oftentimes you'll get that alert that, something is already listed on your patient's chart. It's sort of a maintenance med. And every time you go to prescribe it, you're warned that you're duplicating the therapy. And so I can see where that one might be
a little bit frustrating. That's a couple extra clicks to approve that. This is more intended for when you truly are duplicating it and you don't know, that your colleague just wrote for something for this patient. That I think this is a bit of a holdover from that hospital setting that we talked about previously, but this is on or off. You can't control it other than that. The last one on this list is dose range safety checking, and this one has to do with, is the individual dose too high or too low? Is the duration too long or too short? Or is the frequency per day, too frequent or not frequent enough? And so these will be on or off. The one we see a lot, and I wish I could remember what drug it was, but there's one alert that you get, and it'll say, this medication should not be given more than twice a day. And what you've written was once every 12 hours. And so we know that there is a slight difference in that, but it's one of these alerts that doesn't make sense. I can see where that would be frustrating. Those alerts are based off of the drug data that we get from FTB. So if you're running into these, I would love to see an example of it. I would certainly like to submit a request on your behalf about why you're seeing an alert like that if it doesn't make sense. But again, as I mentioned, if this page is totally new to you, that means probably all of these are on to the highest alert levels, and you could come in and make adjustments based on what you learned in this session. While we're at it, safety checking override reasons, you are in control of the type of override reasons that you get. This is an office-wide setting. These are the 3 that you have available to you already in the system. You may be fine with these. If you find you're always typing the same thing over and over again, I would hop into this little portal here and create a new override reason. So that way you always see it in your dropdown and you don't have to type it out each time. We talked earlier about all the different drugs that are listed in here, and there's thousands of drugs and hundreds of thousands of these dosing statements. And these, again, are outsourced to us from FTB. And in your system, you have control over the type of drugs and the type of statements that you see when you're searching for these medications. So I've put the pathway here. If you wanted to try this out, you'll head into eRx administration and click on something called orderable exclusions. And a good example here would be albuterol. And so I'm looking at all the different albuterol formulations that are out there. And you'll see there's a variety of things that are kind of like the black here and medication history and prescribed. And you'll see really light gray. And these light gray ones are ones you're not currently seeing, but are available in the database. And so like an oral tablet for albuterol, not very popular. You've got the liquids in that, you might write for that. You'll see sometimes on other medication stuff that would only be appropriate for like ventilators and ORs and things like that. If you find when you're prescribing albuterol that you really don't want to see a lot of these options, this is the place to go in and control that. And what you would do is simply based on the medication you don't want to see is click that little minus sign and turn that into a plus. And so what you'll do is that'll update each one of these medications. This doesn't remove them from the system completely, but it makes it so that the initial search results provided to you when you're prescribing won't include those. And you could still switch over to full product search to see everything in the database. It's not gone for good, but it sort of eliminates the clutter that might show up on the screen when you're searching for albuterol. The same concept applies for the statements. And if you think about albuterol, there's so many options that are in there for all the different numbers of puffs and how many times per day. So you can go in and hide those. If it's, as I said, too much clutter on the screen, you could take the time and go in and check some of those off. If what I've just covered sounds like something you want to take advantage of, it's pretty easy to just pick out a couple drugs that you prescribe all the time, go in and just take a look at it and make those configuration changes. Don't let it be this overwhelming thing that you've got to go in and look at every drug you've ever prescribed. So that being said, we've talked about the statements that exist, the medications that exist, and sort of hiding the ones you're not using. But what about the drugs that you do want to see, but you don't have available to you right now? And we'll hop out of this and just take a quick look at how you could actually set that up. So if you have administration rights, you'll want to get logged in. Head into the eRx task queue. Head to administration. And then you'll be down working in a couple sections called custom medications and custom sentences. And the first one I'd start with is custom medications. And when you think about this section, this is where you could enter compounds that you want to be able to prescribe. And so we've added a couple custom compounds that are kind of common, the Magic Mouthwash and the APNO. As I mentioned earlier, everybody has a different formulation they like for the diaper pastes and creams and things. And so we can certainly add them for you so that they're nicely itemized about the different types of ingredients and the ratios. But if you want to be able to do it yourself, this is the page you could do that. This is a great place to also add speech therapy prescriptions, or if you have a very specific type of diapers that you like to prescribe for your younger patients and you're not seeing it in the system, this is how you would add it. And this is how you get it to qualify for electronic transmission. So instead of that on the fly approach we looked at earlier, this would be so that SureScripts will approve it and send it off to the pharmacy. So in this case, let's take a look. We'll just create a speech therapy prescription and I'll walk you through what that looks like. So you want to put in the description field how you'd like that to be found in the system, because you're essentially adding this to your office-wide database. Next up, you have to select a route. And in this case, the one that's probably the most appropriate is miscellaneous. If you were to scroll down, you'd see a lot of options that would not necessarily apply to outpatient pediatrics. But in this case, we'll pick miscellaneous. Here's the part I find users get a little hung up on. You have to check one of these two boxes, and you might have a moral crisis here for a moment, because you say, well, it's not a DME and it's not a compound. Well, I'm with you on that. You have to pick one of these two options here in order to have it codified for SureScripts to send it off to the pharmacy. So I usually just pick compound, even though we know that it's not. And then we will add custom first step item. So what that did is it added speech therapy prescription down here at the bottom. That could be the end of my effort that I put in here. I could then go into the patient's chart, and where I normally search for amoxicillin, I could search for speech therapy and that would come up, but it wouldn't have any of those custom statements. And so you could take it one step further right now and add a little bit of information. So I'll just demo what that looks like. There's two ways you can get to that. You can click up here at the top, click here to go to custom sentences, or go back to administration and scroll down to that same section, and you'll be able to access it from there as well. So once you're in custom medications, you'll want to search for the medication that you want to add statements to. And this is the same technique that you would use to add it for drugs. So existing drugs, if you wanted to create a custom albuterol statement, or if you think about azithromycin or prednisone, if there's tapers that you want to use and loading doses that you want to use that don't already exist in the system, this is a great way to do that as well. So in this case, we'll stick with the speech therapy prescription. We'll pull that up. If I had any other statements already written, they'd be displayed here, but this one's brand new. So I'll click on add custom medication item, and I'll be prompted to enter some information here. In the case of speech therapy prescription, I don't have like a dose and a frequency and certain instructions. So things like speech therapy prescriptions, or as I mentioned, the specific diapers that you want, your best bet would be click on instruction only, which is the option here at the top. And then you could enter in whatever information you want to send over either to the pharmacy or to the specialist about your patient. If, for example, this was a medication that you wanted to do something with, you could say, 2 to 3, you could do puffs, how many times a day, things like that. And you could, add your PRN information in, add any other free text instructions. But once you enter that information and save it, go into the patient's chart, search for speech therapy, that next window will pop open and you'll see the instructions that you've already set up here. So this is, as I mentioned, if you're writing the same thing all over the time for azithromycin, stuff like that, you can come in here and add some custom sentences that will apply to your patients and save yourself a little bit of time going forward. All right, next let's talk about renewal requests and change requests. And these are two pieces of information that come inbound to PCC EHR on the Rx task queue from pharmacies. These are both optional services, and I'll show you how to connect to those in a moment. I think they're pretty cool. They don't work for everybody. So renewal requests being the information where you've previously written something and the patient's already taken all the medication, and in theory, it's supposed to be that the patient wants another fill and not that the pharmacy just generated it for them. But this is the way the pharmacy can reach out to you and say, would you mind refilling another month or two of this medication? And instead of those coming in by fax or a phone call, you'd receive those on the queue instead. Change requests are something where you might write a prescription and send it off to the pharmacy. And if the pharmacy is participating and you've enabled this feature for you, and let's say that they wanted to change the medication a little bit. Maybe there was a prior authorization. Maybe you wrote it for 30 days and the insurance will cover 90. It'll save the patient a little bit of money. Instead of them picking up the phone and calling you, they can send you an electronic message to have that conversation instead. So lots to be said about these. Configuration wise, this is a per provider permission. So you can go into user admin inside PCC EHR and you can enable or disable these features. So if you wanted to sign up for renewals, you click the top box or change request down there at the bottom. And not everybody has to sign up for this. You could have half of the office that wants to use these and half of it just says, just send me the fax or have those phone conversations. So this is an example of what a renewal would look like from the pharmacy. It's pretty straightforward. They send a message over for this patient. You've previously written this medication and they would like to have an extension on that treatment. So you can approve it for any number of fills. It looks like they sent over one fill, but you could click approve and do it for a whole year, depending on the medication. You can deny it if you don't want to approve this at all. This will expose a drop down with a bunch of different denial reasons that you can pick from. A pretty neat option, I think, on this screen that I don't think gets used a lot is called replace with new prescription. So imagine with me that they sent this prescription for Topamax over and it's a 15 milligrams. Maybe you want to do it for a higher strength, right? You've been working them up to this strength and you want to change that. So instead of just straight up denying it, you can click on replace with new prescription and it'll pull up a pretty familiar window and let you make changes to that prescription and send it off right from the Rx task queue. The fourth option on this screen is being able to reassign it to another user. So maybe I covered for my colleague last month and this came in addressed to me again, but they're back from vacation and I don't want to be the one responsible for filling this going forward. I can click on reassign and send that off to the other user that will take it off of my queue and put it onto their queue for them to address when they get to it. Also, if pharmacies are sending multiple requests because you haven't responded yet for whatever reason, you will no longer see separate requests for these because that was a thing for a little while. Now you'll see these all kind of collected together so you can see the number of times that the pharmacy has reached out and you can again approve one or deny the whole batch. Change requests are, as I mentioned, a little bit different. This is a prescription that you've sent over to the pharmacy and traditionally they would call you on the phone and maybe they would talk to one of the nurses on the triage staff or they would get you on the phone directly, but they would have a conversation about the prescription that you just sent and some suggested alterations to it. The one that we see the most right now is switching from a 30-day prescription that you originally wrote to changing it to a 90-day prescription. And if the pharmacy formats it correctly, when they send it over to us, everything is great. You'd see what you see here at the top. You'd have a listing here of the prescription you originally wrote. And you might say, well, I don't want to do 90 days for any reason. You can just keep that original prescription and send that communication back to the pharmacy. So you've sort of avoided needing that phone call. Or if you're interested in the suggested substitution, you can click accept at the bottom and that'll send that back over for the 90 tablets. This part's great because it'll go back into the chart and it'll update that you actually sent 90 instead of 30 and things like that. What we're finding, because this is so new in the industry, that the pharmacies mean really well when they're sending these requests over to you, but they're not formatted in a way that we can absorb them properly and display them for you on the queue. So you might see something like this instead. So they wrote a little note. You wrote it for 30 days and they say the patient's insurance will cover up 90, but you might notice you don't have that second option at the bottom to accept that suggested substitution. So it's almost like they sent you a text message about it, but didn't send you a way to respond to it. You'll also notice there's no way for you to sort of dismiss it. You can't change anything about it. You can't get rid of it. So if this happens to you, and we do get a lot of calls about this, just take a screenshot if you've got time, or just jot down the information. Give us a call at PCC or send an email over. It's pretty easy for us to delete these in the database, but at this point, it does require development assistance to remove those. This is one of the things that we are actively working on making improvements to, because it would be nice for you to be able to make an edit to that, right? So they suggested 90 days, but we don't give you an opportunity to change that if they didn't send it to you in the proper format. So maybe give you a chance to change that if you need to, just delete it or dismiss it and things like that. So just hang in there with these. I think it's a really cool service, but not all the pharmacies are sending it in the ways that we were expecting. There is a whole standard to this. So hopefully we'll have those new changes for you shortly to be able to kind of address these a little bit better. With change requests, there's 7 different types of change requests. Might just be changing 2 medications. You ask for a brand name, DAW, something, the patient's insurance won't cover it, stuff like that. So this should, in theory, save those phone calls to your staff, but only if they're formatted correctly. So stay tuned on those changes. We'll be sure to get that information out to you once those are available. Okay, let's cover a couple of things you can try out when you're troubleshooting with PCC eRx. You're always welcome to call us, but for those of you that like to try to figure things out on your own, I'll give you a couple tips and tricks on how to do that. First up is just checking the status of a sent prescription. So imagine with me, you sent the prescription, the patient left, you're now working with the next patient of the day, and someone from the pharmacy calls and says they didn't get the prescription. This happens quite a bit. You have some information available to you that you can let the pharmacy staff know that you see here that it was actually delivered and verified on their end. So in order to reach that information, you would hop into the visit or the phone note that you wrote that prescription, scroll down to the bottom in the review and sign screen and hover your mouse over that eRx, that red timestamp, and you'll see the information there. Now, best case scenario, it says it's completed and they've got it, so you can give that information to them and they should kind of look for it on their end. You might see some delays in the system, and it would say that, that it's pending, the status hasn't been verified yet. So that gives you some information about giving us a call, because maybe we can find out what's going on there. But that will give you better awareness of kind of the status of the prescription and where it is in the process. I will share that in my years of working in the pharmacy, when these electronic messages come in, it's kind of like your eLabs queue, if you use that a little bit, that these electronic messages come in and they're not directly mapped to that patient. So there is a human interaction there where they have to map that electronic message to the right patient. So they could have mapped it to a patient with a similar name, to the wrong patient, completely. You also can delete them because sometimes there's duplicates and stuff like that. So there is reasons sometimes where you might see that it's been verified, they have it, and they don't seem to know where it is. So you can definitely push back on that a little bit. We are more than happy to open a case with SureScripts about these transmission-based issues. Sometimes they will offer to call and speak to the pharmacy about the way the system is working, because maybe there's an issue on their end. The only thing to watch out there is these have to be submitted within 10 business days. So if you're running into what feels like a consistent problem with a pharmacy in your area, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be happy to put in a case to see if we're able to help in any way. There is also additional information for sent prescriptions available to you at all times. I've highlighted a very tiny gray box here in orange, just next to that red timestamp for the prescribed information. If you are interested at all, you can click on that little box and it will expose this window that we're looking at here. This tells you more information about what was sent over to the pharmacy. You'll see on the right-hand side, it's in green, it's a success, it's been delivered. So again, if the pharmacy calls you explaining that they don't think that they have it, you have a little bit more information that it has been delivered. You also can see ultimately what was sent, like the volume, the number of tablets, and things like that. So great information here. If you really like super techie stuff, you can click on this message XML that's kind of in the computer language. You can take a look at that as well. Sometimes you might run into this message, why can't I access PCC ERX for this patient? Oftentimes this is pertaining to the merging of two accounts in the practice management side of the house. If there were corresponding EHR visits for those patients, sometimes when those get merged, it can be a little confusing for PCC ERX, and you are potentially trying to prescribe inside a visit for a patient that no longer truly exists. So if you run into this, the first thing you can try before calling us is just opening up a new encounter. So the easiest thing there is to just create a phone note, try to hop back into PCC ERX. If you can get in, that means you're good at least to get that prescription out, because the patient's probably in the office waiting for the medication. Otherwise, if you feel like you're totally stuck, just give us a call. Our number is listed right here. These are pretty easy for us to resolve and get you back to prescribing again. And I'll leave you with a couple just notes here on this screen. The first two we've already talked about. Those are just the pathways to get to hide drugs and sentences or add new ones if you're not finding what you want. I know there's a lot of vitamins out there. If you've got this specific name in mind and you'd rather have it entered, you can certainly do that using custom meds. At any point, if you are stuck while you're prescribing, it seems like something's frozen or something's just spinning. At any point, you can use your mouse or on your laptop, do a right mouse click, and it'll pop up an option for reload PCC ERX. That should refresh that screen. What you're doing here is avoiding the need to log all the way back out or restarting your computer. That's a really quick way to just kind of refresh that screen and get you back in continuing with your prescriptions. We can add any external website in Review and Sign. Review and Sign is that sort of yellow component at the very bottom of the prescribing ribbon. In most cases, we've put a link to your PDMP, your prescription drug monitoring program for your state. If you'd like a link to Hippocrates or any other kind of drug reference website, that's really easy for us to do. Just let us know. And I've put a link here for all the other videos and documentation that's available out there on PCC ERX. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.